Hello everyone, and welcome back to Green Magic. This is Card Draw episode 3 of 10, and this one is about Power Draw. There's significantly fewer cards on this list than in the previous ones. There's only 10 cards that will be on this list, and a few of them will be appropriate in the other lists that are coming up, and will also appear on those, but do follow the pattern of caring about the power of one or more of your creatures. So just to get started, let's once again talk about what decks you might want to put these in. And one of the first things that I thought of was Mael the Enema. It is 3 mana, all of which is colored, including a single red, green, and white. 2/3 Elf Shaman for 6 mana, including red, green, white, and tap it to look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a creature card with power 5 or greater from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library, in any order. So this one wants you to have a bunch of creatures in your deck that are power 5 or greater. You can whiff with her ability, but you always want to have you want to make sure that you have plenty of big creatures in your library so that you usually won't whiff, and the card draw spells in this list will help you to also refill your hand, so that if you got a ton of mana, you can pay the 6 tapper to get something for kind of for free, but not really because you're paying 6 from your library on into play. But then you can also use the card draw spells in this list to refill your hand so that you can also cast those and dig even deeper and do more things. The next card is Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma, 4 mana, including a single green, 4/3 bear. He says that creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. And whenever it attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. The way I built this deck was, by rule, every creature had to have power 4 or greater. I wanted every creature in my deck to benefit from his costing 2 less to cast. I know there's at least one small creature that has the same effect, so it would be smart to include that other card for redundancies to make your big creatures cost less and less and less. But since you already know that this deck is going to want probably a lot of creatures, probably big creatures, anything that draws you cards based on the power of those creatures, that's going to be a natural fit for that deck. And if you are patient enough, if you don't need them right away, like for haste purposes or whatever, you can always wait till main phase 2 when they're 1 power stronger and draw that extra 1 card. Third is Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, 3 mana, including double green. It's a 2/3 Elf Scout. It says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. And you can pay a green and tap it to add X mana in any combination of colors to your mana pool, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Both abilities care about the creature's power. It wants you to have big creatures. And I believe this commander actually sees some CDH play. I believe that the people who try to build her in a very powerful way care about really big creatures that have a huge drawback, but you don't care about it. You just use her mana ability while the creature's on the battlefield to sneak in a bunch of mana. Obviously draw a card when it comes into play, but then get a bunch of mana, and then you have to sacrifice the other creature or whatever else. But obviously, the way she's designed, you want big creatures, and so anything that will draw you a bunch of cards for just having a big creature, that's going to benefit you greatly in that kind of deck. And then the fourth one that I wanted to mention was Ghalta, Primal Hunger. He's 12 mana, including double green. He's a 12/12 Elder Dinosaur. He has trample, and also he costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control. Why I kind of brought him up was, generically, if you have any commander that is like power 5 or greater, whether you're in a creature deck or not, whether you're looking to do combat damage or not, if your commander just has like 5 or greater power, a card draw spell that will draw you at least 5 cards is going to be pretty good. Galta is the example that I wanted to use right here just because he's about as big as it gets. He is also probably going to be a creature-centric deck, whether you swarm with other creatures or you just like go Voltron with him because he's big and he has trample. Even if he's, for whatever reason, the only creature in the deck, he's the only creature you need, or whatever other creature you might have as your commander. If your commander is the only creature in your deck, as long as it has power 5 or greater, and you intend on having it in play, one of these card draw spells from this list will draw you that many cards and is beneficial to have in a deck like that. So let's get started with Garruk, Primal Hunter. 5 mana, including triple green. He's a planeswalker that starts with 3 loyalty. He's Garruk. His +1 ability is create a 3/3 green beast creature token. You won't usually use that unless you don't need the card draw or you just need creatures. I mean, that's kind of situational. You won't usually care about that too much. His -3 is draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. That's why he's on this list, and we'll get to that in a second. His -6 is create a 6/6 green worm creature token for each land you control. Now, generally speaking, his ultimate's not really his ultimate. His -3 is his ultimate, because he can come down with 3 loyalty, do his -3 immediately, and you're going to draw a ton of cards for the 5 mana that it costs to cast him. The -6 is not something that you're generally going to build towards or care about. It's the card draw. So this is the first of 4 cards. The first 4 cards on this video that you're going to see are the 4 that I would say should go in a great number of decks as key components of the card draw package, provided you're not doing like Elf Ball or a bunch of like a swarm of little creatures. As long as you have, either your commander is big or a lot of the creatures in the 99 are big. He's 5 mana, ult him immediately, draw 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 cards, whatever. The +1 is just if you happen to have drawn him from another big card draw spell and you don't need to draw immediately. The -6, you should probably never even get to that. Maybe if you have Doubling Season out and he starts at 6 and you're just like, hey, all my stuff has haste, I might as well swarm the board with a bunch of creatures, which, because Doubling Season is out, you get twice that many tokens, win, and sure, you can use Garruk as an instant win in that case, provided that you have Doubling Season and a haste enabler. But otherwise, it's the card draw that makes him vital to so many decks. The next card, the second card of the 4 that I would say go in just about any deck with big creatures that you absolutely want as a core piece of your card draw package, is Return of the Wildspeaker. It's 5 mana, including a single green. This one's instant speed, which can be important. And it says you have 2 modes. Choose one. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. Usually that's just going to be your biggest creature. And non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. So you have the option to make him a combat buff in the way of like Overwhelm, Overrun, Overwhelming Stampede, stuff like that. Stuff that just gives your team +2/+2, +3/+3, +5/+5, whatever till end of turn. And his doesn't give trample like some of the other ones, so it's not necessarily as good depending on what all your board has going for it already. But it certainly can win you games that way. But the reason that it's on this list and the reason that it should go in more decks, the +3/+3 would apply to decks that want to go wide and have a lot of creatures. The reason why it goes in far more decks than that, why it's more applicable to a wider range of deck styles is the ability to draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. Which, again, if you have any kind of big creature, it's going to draw you 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cards. You can do it at instant speed, so if you want to do it during the end step of someone's turn before yours, honestly, usually I'll just cast it main phase 1 while I'm having a big explosive turn anyway and looking to rebuild. But it's up to you how tricky you want to get with it, or if for some reason maybe you're like in a Gore Claw deck where your stuff is going to get bigger during combat, or for whatever reason, maybe you have other combat tricks, so you want to use this to draw the cards during combat, and then maybe you get your other combat buffs from having drawn them. The third card that is part of the 4 great these should go in any deck with big creatures is Rishkar's Expertise. 6 mana, including double green. This one's sorcery speed. You draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and you may cast a card with converted mana cost 5 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. This one is extremely good. It's also extremely popular. As I keep saying, there's 4 cards that go together that if you're going to run one, you should probably run them all. They are great additions to a draw package, and the one that makes this one stand out above the others is the fact that you also, after having done it, get to cast something that's 5 mana or less. So whether it's just another creature, it's a key enchantment or something like that, even if it's something that you think is not very scary or important or a priority, like an explosive vegetation, getting a free explosive vegetation after having drawn a bunch of cards is going to be huge for your game plan for future turns at the very least. So this one rightfully sees a ton of play, but the power of it should also kind of give you an idea of why the other ones should see more play. And then the final card that's on the same package is Soul's Majesty. 5 mana, including a single green. Also a sorcery. Draw cards equal to the power of target creature you control. So while the other two, one is the greatest power among non-human, the other one is greatest power. This one is power of target creature. So if you were to target your biggest creature and then an opponent removed it at instant speed, they do have an extra way to make this fizzle, whereas the other ones would just go to the next biggest thing when they go to resolve. So it does have that weakness, potentially. But also, it could be an advantage in that if you have a big creature that you're figuring is going to draw removal anyway, like a Blightsteel Colossus, and you're worried that someone's holding up their Swords to Plowshare or something, you can just target something else and say, hey, are you going to let this resolve and I draw 5 cards because of this thing that I targeted with Soul's Majesty? Or are you going to use your Swords to Plowshare on my biggest creature, my scariest thing? So you do have the option to kind of hedge your bet and force your opponents to use their removal to either get rid of your biggest, scariest thing or your ability to draw cards. Also, if for whatever reason, say you have a good number of cards in hand and you feel like drawing 12 is overkill, but drawing 5 or 6, it's reasonable. It'll refill your hand without you having to just discard 90% of them. Say that this is all the mana that you have and you don't want to just draw a bunch just to turn around and discard them during your end step, then you could just target a smaller creature and then refill your hand as much as you need without overkill. It's also 5 mana, which is worth pointing out that it is a little bit cheaper than the previous one, the Rishkar, but it is equal in price to the Return and also the Garruk. So that can make a difference sometimes. Sometimes you just don't have that 6th mana for the bigger one, so it is a little bit extra valuable that way. Next is Nissa's Revelation. 7 mana, including double green. It's a sorcery. Tells you to scry 5, then reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, you draw cards equal to its power, and you gain life equal to its toughness. So this one I don't include on the same list as the other 4 for like 2 reasons. One, it doesn't just care if you have one big creature in your deck, such as I pointed out with if your commander is big, all you need is your commander on the battlefield, and then you can draw a bunch of cards from that. This one requires for your deck to have a bunch of big creatures in it. Pretty critical mass if you don't want to whiff, and even then, even if you have 30 big creatures, there's still a chance that you'll whiff, and that's generally something that I am risk averse to. But you do get to scry 5, so you do get to dig pretty deep, and it also does have a little bit of life gain, so that's fine, but it also costs 7 mana, so it's more restrictive, but it is very budget, and it's definitely worth including if you are already in the critical mass of big creatures deck. Next is Grothama, all Devouring, 5 mana, including double green. It's a 10/8 legendary worm. It says other creatures have, when this creature attacks, you may have it fight Grothama. And when Grothama leaves the battlefield, each player draws cards equal to the amount of damage dealt to it by this turn by sources they controlled. So this is a very strange one. I think I'll end up putting it on a few of the other lists because of just how it falls into several categories. It's very weird, and it can benefit your opponents. So generally, if you're not looking to do that, you'd want to have some way to cast him and then have your creatures kill it, either if they already have a fight ability before you go to combat. That way you can maybe draw before combat. If you have to go to combat, then you can fight him along the way. You don't want to bother having your weak little 1/1 with Death Touch fight him, because then you'll only draw 1 card because your Death Toucher only did 1 damage to Grothama. But if you have something big like a 12/12 Ghalta, the Ghalta will deal 12 damage to the Grothama despite him having 8 toughness, and you'll draw 12. So he does require a lot more consideration for the rest of the deck. You do have to make sure that you are suited to take advantage of his ability, and simply sacrificing him like to a altar, Ashnod's altar, Phyrexian altar, won't get you any benefit besides the mana you get from the altar itself. So yeah, very conditional. You do have to make sure that you're doing it right to benefit off of it. But if you do it right, then you can get a pretty good amount of cards from him. Next is Lifeblood Hydra. It is triple green and X, so a variable mana cost. He's a 0/0 Hydra. He has trample, and when he enters the battlefield, he enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it. And when he dies, you gain life and draw cards equal to its power. So again, a little bit of life gain tacked onto that. Not terribly important, but he does have to die. In this case, you don't care how he dies. So if you did have one of the altars that you could sacrifice him to, or you had another sacrifice effect, which is coming up in just a moment, then you can benefit that way. Just kill him directly yourself. Or honestly, if you just make him really big, you can just keep swinging out with a big trample creature and make your opponent take the damage or deal with it. And if they deal with it without exiling it, you draw a bunch of cards in response. So he can be one of those catch-22 creatures where if your opponents leave him alive, you keep beating him in the face and gaining, and you're benefiting that way. Or if they do kill it, you draw a bunch of cards and benefit that way. So you do have a little bit of flexibility in how you would want to approach this creature, and both are good. Neither one is going to be bad for you. Yeah, strategically, I don't know what else I can say about this that you wouldn't be able to figure out for yourself. Next is Greater Good. It is 4 mana, including double green. This one's an enchantment, and it says sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then discard 3 cards. So obviously this one will appear again on another video about, sacrifice, draw. And this one would combo well with like the Lifeblood Hydra that we just saw. This one, it doesn't appeal to me because I don't like drawing cards and then discarding. The looting or rummaging effects are just not my playstyle. And graveyard based decks, generally not my playstyle. But if you're playing a graveyard deck, this is an obvious include. So if you're doing something like a Muldrotha, you can just sacrifice stuff, put stuff in your graveyard, keep doing it, and everything in your graveyard is effectively in your hand anyway. So the downside is not necessarily even a downside. But it is a little bit limiting, I think, in terms of if the creature's power is 3, then you draw 3, you discard 3, so you don't really come out ahead unless you're in a graveyard deck. Although you do have card selection that way. If the creature's power is like 2 or 1, then you're losing cards. But again, you could have card selection in that case. So you need to be sacrificing big creatures, which are probably the creatures that you want in play, usually speaking. He has a sack outlet, so if your deck is looking to benefit from sacrificing creatures, or if you're worried about like your opponent stealing your creatures and you just need a sack outlet for some sort of benefit, then here is one that could also generate incidental card draw, depending on the reason for you including it. It does see a lot of play, and depending on how you use it or why you're including it, it could either be doing exactly what you want it to do and be a very good card, or if you're kind of looking at it through the lens of being similar to the other cards on this list, of just drawing you a bunch of cards and that's what your goal is, that's your only goal with it, then consider using the other cards on this list, because this is weaker than those other ones for the reason that it forces you to discard 3. Next is Life's Legacy, 2 mana, including a single green. It's a sorcery, and it says as an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature. You draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So, again, this one wants you to sacrifice a big creature, so, yeah, that's not necessarily what I would want to do in a lot of decks, but again, if you have graveyard stuff, you don't mind putting it there, especially if you're going to do one of those black spells that, flip your graveyard in the battlefield, then you would want to put your good stuff in the graveyard so that when you do the reverse, then it'll end up back in play. Otherwise, the main benefit to this card, I think, is that it's only 2 mana. It is sorcery speed, so if for some reason an opponent tried to steal a creature and then you want to do this in response, you can't without a Vidalcan Orrery type effect. But if... Yeah, I mean, it's just situational. If you have a good reason or deck type that would make use of it, then by all means, synergy is important. But if you're just looking for something that will draw you a bunch of cards, then there's going to be better options. If it's just card draw for you, then you should go with something else rather than this. And next is basically the same thing, Momentous Fall, 4 mana, including double green. As an additional cost to cast the spell, sacrifice a creature, and you draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then you gain life equal to its toughness. So Again, this one has the life gain tacked onto it. Not a big deal usually. It costs twice as much mana, so that's a downside. But the fact that it is instant speed does give it the benefit that I just pointed out the previous card doesn't have, which is if your opponent tries to steal something or does a board wipe, or you can sacrifice a creature in response to still recoup some benefit if it's a board wipe. If they're trying to steal it, you can sacrifice it in response to negate that effect, to deny them that card so that they don't get the benefit of the creature. Also, what you could just do is say you have a good number of cards in hand. You're towards the end of you're running out of mana, but you can hold up 4. You wait till the person before you use end step, and then during their end step cast this, sacrifice some big creature, draw 9 cards or whatever. Then during your turn, you untap, you draw a card, and now you got, like, what would that be? 7 plus 9 plus the card you drew. You have 17 cards in hand, and you can actually do whatever big play it is you want to do. So it's a way to enable a big play for the following turn. If that's more your game style, where you're patient enough to be tricky like that, then this would be good for that kind of deck. But otherwise, if you're just doing it for its face value of drawing, just a bunch of cards, the cards at the beginning of this video would be better suited. So if you don't have a good reason, stick to those ones. But if your deck kind of does mesh with this one, then it's great for the decks that it would belong in. And it's also pretty cheap too, so it's very budget and worth considering including. That's it for this video, so keep an eye out for the next one.